The Oklahoma sunrise painted the Bennett Ranch in shades of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the weathered barn where Cole Bennett had spent every morning for the past 3 years preparing for this moment. At 22, he carried the lean build of someone who'd grown up throwing hay bales and fixing fence posts, but his eyes held something different. The burning intensity of a man who'd found his calling in the most dangerous 8 seconds sport could offer. Cole adjusted his worn leather chaps and checked the buckle on his protective vest for the 3rd time. The Tulsa State Fair rodeo was just 6 hours away, and his stomach churned with a mixture of excitement and pure terror that he'd learned to recognize as the feeling every bull rider lived for. This wasn't just another local competition at the county fair. This was his shot at proving he belonged among Oklahoma's elite riders. "You're gonna wear a hole in that vest if you keep messin' with it," came the familiar voice of his father, Frank Bennett, as he emerged from the main house carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. At 55, Frank moved with the careful deliberation of a man whose body bore the scars of 30 years working cattle, but his eyes sparkled with the same determination that burned in his son. Cole accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping his calloused hands around the warm ceramic. "Can't help it, Dad. Been dreamin' about this since I was 8 years old, watching you compete at the national finals." Frank's weathered face creased into a smile. He'd retired from professional rodeo after a particularly nasty encounter with a bull named Tornado left him with a permanently stiff right knee and the wisdom to know when to hang up his spurs. But watching Cole develop his natural talent had reignited something in the older man that he thought had died with his competitive days. "You remember what I told you about Volcano?" Frank asked, settling onto the wooden fence rail that bordered their practice arena. The arena itself was modest, just a circular pen with wooden railings and soft dirt that Cole had personally maintained for 3 years, dreaming of days like today. Cole nodded solemnly. Volcano wasn't just any bull. He was a legend in Oklahoma rodeo circles. A massive Black Angus crossbreed weighing nearly 2,000 pounds, with a reputation for being smart, aggressive, and utterly unpredictable. In his 5-year career, only 3 riders had successfully completed an 8-second ride on Volcano, and 2 of those had ended up in the hospital despite their success. 16 riders have tried him this season. Cole recited the statistics he'd memorized. Only 1 made it to the buzzer, and Jake Morrison broke 2 ribs in the process. "That's right," Frank said, taking a long sip of his coffee. "So why'd you specifically request him when the coordinator said you could draw any bull in the amateur division?" Cole was quiet for a moment, watching the morning mist rise from the pasture where their small herd of cattle grazed peacefully. The question cut to the heart of everything he'd been feeling for months. He could have chosen easier bulls, built up his record gradually, played it safe. But something deep inside him demanded more. "Because if I'm going to make it in this sport, really make it, I can't spend my life riding bulls that everyone expects me to beat," Cole finally answered. "Volcano's the kind of bull that separates the wannabes from the real riders. If I can handle him, prove I belong in the same arena as guys like Tyler Maddox and Buck Stevens, then I'll know this isn't just some fantasy." Frank studied his son's face, recognizing something he'd seen in his own mirror decades ago. Cole had inherited more than just his father's athletic ability. He'd gotten the Bennett stubborn streak that had driven Frank to chase his own rodeo dreams despite breaking nearly every bone in his body at least once. "Your mama's worried sick, you know," Frank said gently. "She's been prayin' over you every night since you signed up for this thing." Cole's expression softened. Sarah Bennett had never quite understood the magnetic pull that rodeo held over the men in her family, but she'd never tried to stop them either. She'd spent countless nights in emergency rooms, patching up scrapes and bruises, celebrating victories and comforting defeats. Her quiet strength had been the foundation that allowed both Frank and Cole to chase their dreams. "She say anything to you about it?" Cole asked. "You know your mother. She won't say a word against your dreams, but I can see it in her eyes. She's scared, son. And honestly, so am I." Cole turned to face his father directly. "You ever regret it? All those years on the circuit, all the injuries, the time away from home." Frank was quiet for a long time, absently rubbing his bad knee. "There's parts one regret, sure. Missed your first steps because I was laid up in a Denver hospital with a concussion. Missed your high school graduation because I was chasing points in Fort Worth. But the riding itself? The competition? That feeling when everything goes perfect and you and the bull are dancing together for 8 seconds? Never regretted a second of that. That's what I'm after," Cole said quietly. "That feeling you used to describe to me when I was little. Like for 8 seconds, You're doing exactly what you were put on Earth to do. Frank smiled and clapped his son on the shoulder. Well then, we better make sure you're ready to find out if Volcano's gonna give you that feeling or teach you a lesson about humility. They spent the next 2 hours in the practice arena, with Frank putting Cole through the same routine they'd followed every morning for months. Cole practiced his mounting technique on their mechanical bull, working on his grip, his balance, and most importantly, his mindset. The mental game was as crucial as the physical preparation. 8 seconds on a 2,000-pound animal that wanted nothing more than to plant you face first in the dirt required absolute focus. Remember, Volcano's got a signature move, Frank called out as Cole worked on his positioning. About 4 seconds in, he'll do this spinning jump thing, throwing his back end way up and to the right. It's caught more riders off guard than anything else in his repertoire. Cole nodded, visualizing the move in his mind. He'd watched hours of footage of Volcano's previous rides, studying the bull's patterns and tendencies. Every bull had preferences, habits that smart riders could anticipate and prepare for. The key was staying loose enough to react while maintaining enough control to avoid getting thrown. At 10 o'clock, Sarah Bennett emerged from the house wearing her best dress and an expression that tried to hide her anxiety behind maternal pride. At 48, she still carried the natural beauty that had caught Frank's eye at a county fair dance 25 years ago, but today her face showed the strain of watching her son prepare to risk everything for a dream she couldn't fully understand. "You boys ready for some breakfast?" she called out, her voice artificially cheerful. "I made Cole's favorite blueberry pancakes and bacon." Cole dismounted from the practice bull and jogged over to kiss his mother on the cheek. "Thanks, Mama. You didn't have to go to any trouble." "No trouble at all," Sarah replied, smoothing down a stubborn cowlick in Cole's dark hair. "Besides, you need to keep your strength up for this afternoon." They gathered around the kitchen table that had served as the heart of the Bennett household for 2 decades. The walls were covered with photographs chronicling Frank's rodeo career and Cole's journey from a gap-toothed 8-year-old on his first pony to the determined young man sitting across from them now. "You nervous?" Sarah asked, passing Cole a plate stacked high with pancakes. "Terrified," Cole admitted with a grin. "But the good kind of terrified." Sarah exchanged a look with Frank. She'd heard that phrase before, usually right before one of the Bennett men ended up in the emergency room. "You remember what Dr. Peterson said after your last concussion," Sarah said carefully. "You promised you'd be more careful." Cole's smile faded slightly. 3 months ago, he'd been thrown from a bull at a small rodeo in Stillwater and spent 2 days in the hospital with a mild concussion. It hadn't been serious, but it had been enough to remind everyone involved just how dangerous this sport really was. "I remember, Mama. And I have been careful. All the safety gear, better technique, smarter choices about which bulls to ride." He paused. "Well, mostly smarter choices." Frank chuckled despite himself. "Volcano's not exactly what most people would call a smart choice, son." "Maybe not," Cole agreed. "But sometimes you gotta take risks to get where you want to go." After breakfast, the family loaded into Frank's weathered pickup truck for the 40-minute drive to Tulsa. The countryside rolled past in familiar patterns, oil derricks dotting the landscape, cattle grazing in endless pastures, and the kind of big sky that made Oklahoma feel infinite. Cole stared out the window, trying to quiet the nervous energy that was building in his chest. He'd been to the Tulsa State Fair countless times as a kid, but never as a competitor in the main event. The fair attracted riders from across the region, and winning here could open doors to bigger competitions, maybe even a shot at the professional circuit. "Tell me about the first time you rode at Tulsa," Cole asked his father, needing the distraction. Frank's eyes crinkled as he navigated the increasingly busy highway leading into the city. "I was about your age, maybe a year older. Thought I was hot stuff because I'd won a few local competitions. Drew a bull named Steamroller, mean old thing with horns like railroad spikes." "Did you make the 8 seconds?" "Barely. Hung on by pure stubbornness and dumb luck. But that ride changed everything for me. Proved I could compete with the big boys, at least sometimes." Sarah reached over and squeezed Cole's hand. "Whatever happens today, we're proud of you. You know that, right?" Cole squeezed back. "I know, Mama." The Tulsa State Fair sprawled across hundreds of acres, a temporary city of carnival rides, food stands, livestock barns, and the massive rodeo arena that would be Cole's stage for the next 8 seconds of his life. The parking lot was already packed with pickup trucks, horse trailers, and families arriving for the afternoon's festivities. Cole could hear the sound of the midway, carnival music, children laughing, the distant voice of an announcer calling out prizes at some game booth. But all of that faded into background noise as they approached the rodeo grounds, and he saw the arena where his dreams would either take flight or crash to earth. "You ready for this?" Frank asked as they grabbed Cole's gear bag from the truck bed. Cole took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his helmet in his hands and the familiar texture of his riding gloves. "Ready as I'll ever be." As they walked toward the competitor's entrance, Cole caught sight of the program board listing the afternoon's events. There it was in black and white: Cole Bennett vs. Volcano Rookie Division Championship Round. His name had never looked so important. The competitors' area behind the Tulsa State Fair Rodeo Arena buzzed with the controlled chaos that Cole had come to love about rodeo culture. Cowboys in various stages of preparation sprawled across hay bales and folding chairs, some stretching tight muscles, others methodically taping joints and checking equipment. The air smelled of leather, liniment, and the dust that seemed to permeate everything connected to the sport. Cole found a quiet corner near the back fence and began his pre-ride ritual. First, he laid out his gear with military precision: helmet, protective vest, riding gloves, and the rope that would be his only connection to 1,500 pounds of angry bull. Each piece had been carefully selected and broken in over months of practice, and touching them now provided a sense of familiarity in an environment designed to test every limit. "Bennett, right?" A voice interrupted his concentration. Cole looked up to see Jake Morrison approaching, his left arm still in a sling from his encounter with Volcano 6 weeks earlier. Jake was 25, a veteran of the amateur circuit with a reputation for riding bulls that other cowboys avoided. "That's right," Cole replied, standing to shake Jake's outstretched hand. "How's the arm feeling?" Jake flexed his shoulder carefully and winced. "Getting better every day. Doctor says I should be back to competition in another month." He gestured toward Cole's gear. "I heard you drew Volcano for today. Word travels fast around here." "It does when someone requests the most dangerous bull on the circuit for their first major competition," Jake said with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You sure you know what you're getting into?" Cole had fielded variations of this question dozens of times since his draw had been announced, but coming from Jake, it carried extra weight. "I've watched every video I could find, studied his patterns, talked to everyone who's ever ridden him successfully." "Studying him and riding him are two different things," Jake said seriously. "Volcano's not just strong, he's smart. He'll test you in the first 2 seconds, figure out your weaknesses, and then exploit them. The reason I ended up with broken ribs wasn't because he bucked harder than I expected. It was because he did something completely different from what I'd prepared for." Cole absorbed this information, adding it to the mental database he'd been building about his opponent. "Any specific advice?" Jake was quiet for a moment, clearly debating how much to share with someone who was essentially a competitor. "Don't try to muscle him. I made that mistake. Volcano respects riders who can move with him, but he'll punish anyone who tries to dominate through pure strength." He paused. "And whatever you do, don't get cocky if you make it past the 4-second mark." That's when he starts getting creative. Before Cole could respond, the public address system crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Tulsa State Fair Rodeo. Riders will begin bull riding warm-ups in 30 minutes. The announcement sent a ripple of energy through the competitors' area. Cowboys who had been relaxed and casual suddenly shifted into competition mode, double-checking equipment and beginning the mental preparation that would carry them through their rides. Frank appeared at Cole's elbow, carrying a paper cup of coffee and wearing the expression of controlled worry that had become familiar over the past few months. "How you feeling, son?" "Good," Cole replied automatically, then reconsidered. "Actually, I'm scared as hell, but in a good way." Frank smiled. "That's exactly how you should feel. The day you stop being scared of a 2,000-pound bull is the day you need to find a different hobby." Sarah arrived a few minutes later, having made her way through the growing crowd of spectators. She carried a small cooler and wore a forced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I brought you some water and those energy bars you like," she said, handing Cole the cooler. "Make sure you stay hydrated." "Thanks, Mama." Cole could see the worry lines around her eyes and felt a pang of guilt for putting her through this stress. But he also knew that she understood on some level why this mattered so much to him. The warm-up session took place in a smaller practice arena adjacent to the main event space. Cole joined 15 other riders in loosening up their bodies and minds, going through the motions of mounting and dismounting practice bulls, stretching muscles that would be tested to their limits in just a few hours. "First time at Tulsa?" asked a voice beside him. Cole turned to see Tyler Maddox, a legend in Oklahoma rodeo circles, who was competing in the professional division. At 32, Tyler had won more championships than most riders accumulated in entire careers, and his presence at the state fair was a testament to the competition's growing reputation. "Yes, sir," Cole replied, feeling slightly starstruck. He'd watched Tyler ride on television countless times and had several of his competition videos memorized. "I heard you drew Volcano," Tyler said, settling into a stretching routine that spoke of decades of experience. "Gutsy choice for a first-timer." "Maybe gutsy, maybe stupid," Cole admitted. "Time will tell." Tyler laughed. "There's a fine line between those two things in this sport. The trick is learning where that line is without crossing it too many times." He paused his stretching to look directly at Cole. "You got family here?" "My parents. They've been supporting this crazy dream of mine for years." "Good. That matters more than most people realize. Having people who believe in you can make the difference between getting back up after a bad ride and hanging up your spurs." As the warm-up session concluded, Cole felt his nerves beginning to settle into the familiar pre-competition focus that he'd learned to trust. The butterflies were still there, but they were organized now, channeled into the kind of alert readiness that could mean the difference between success and disaster. The main arena was filling up as families and rodeo fans claimed their seats in the wooden bleachers that surrounded the competition area. Cole could see his parents making their way to a section close enough to offer support, but far enough back to avoid seeing too many details if things went wrong. "Bennett," called out the arena coordinator, a weather-beaten man named Pete, who'd been running rodeos across Oklahoma for 20 years. "You're up fourth in the rookie division. That gives you about 90 minutes to get ready. 90 minutes to prepare for 8 seconds that could change everything." Cole made his way to the holding area where the bulls waited in individual chutes, each one a carefully maintained 1,000-pound athlete in his own right. Volcano occupied chute number 7, and Cole approached slowly, wanting to get a sense of the animal he'd be partnering with. The bull was massive, even bigger than Cole had imagined from watching videos. His black hide gleamed under the arena lights, and his shoulders rippled with muscle that spoke of power barely contained. But it was Volcano's eyes that caught Cole's attention, intelligent, alert, and completely unimpressed by the humans studying him from outside the chute. "He's a beauty, isn't he?" said a voice behind Cole. He turned to see Buck Stevens, Volcano's owner, approaching with the careful gait of a man who'd spent 40 years around dangerous animals. Buck was a legend in his own right, having bred and trained some of the most challenging bulls in rodeo history. "He's incredible," Cole replied honestly. "How long have you been working with him?" 5 years now, since he was barely more than a calf. Found him on a ranch outside of Amarillo. Even as a baby, he had this attitude that told you he wasn't going to be pushed around by anyone." Buck scratched Volcano behind the ears, and the massive bull actually seemed to enjoy the attention. "People think these animals are just mindless bucking machines, but Volcano's as smart as any horse I've ever trained. Maybe smarter." Cole watched the interaction between man and bull, fascinated by the obvious respect that existed between them. "Any last-minute advice for riding him?" Buck considered the question carefully. "Volcano doesn't respect fear, but he doesn't tolerate disrespect either. If you treat him like a partner instead of an enemy, he might give you the ride of your life. Try to dominate him, and he'll plant you so hard in the dirt you'll taste Oklahoma clay for a week." As the afternoon wore on, Cole watched the first 3 riders in his division complete their attempts. 2 were thrown before the 4-second mark, and the third managed 6 seconds on a bull named Thunder Road before being launched into the arena dirt. The crowd's energy built with each ride, and Cole could feel the electricity in the air as his turn approached. "Cole Bennett, you're up," Pete called out, and suddenly the 90 minutes of waiting were over. Cole walked toward chute number 7, his legs feeling slightly unsteady beneath him. Frank appeared at his side, carrying Cole's rope and offering the kind of quiet support that had sustained their family through decades of rodeo competition. "Remember everything we practiced," Frank said quietly as they approached the chute. "Trust your training, trust your instincts, and no matter what happens, commit to the full 8 seconds." Cole nodded, pulling on his riding gloves and settling his helmet more securely. As he climbed onto the narrow platform above Volcano's chute, he could hear the announcer introducing him to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, our next rider is 22-year-old Cole Bennett from right here in Oklahoma. Cole's making his debut at the Tulsa State Fair Rodeo, and he's drawn one of the toughest bulls in our lineup, the legendary Volcano." The crowd's cheer was louder than Cole had expected, and he realized that his story, the local kid taking on the most dangerous bull in the competition, had captured people's imagination. He raised his hand briefly to acknowledge the support, then focused entirely on the task ahead. Volcano stood perfectly still in the chute, as if he understood that the real action was about to begin. Cole studied the bull's positioning, checking the rope placement, and making sure his grip was secure. Everything had to be perfect. There would be no second chances once that gate opened. "You ready?" Pete asked, his hand on the gate release. Cole took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 3 years of preparation settling on his shoulders. Somewhere in the stands, his parents were holding their breath. Somewhere in his mind, every piece of advice he'd ever received about bull riding was organizing itself into instinct and muscle memory. He nodded once to Pete, tightened his grip on the rope, and felt Volcano tense beneath him like a coiled spring. The gate swung open, and 8 seconds of destiny began. The moment the gate opened, Cole understood why Volcano was legendary. The bull exploded from the chute with a fury that seemed to shake the entire arena, launching himself into the air with a combination of power and athleticism that no amount of video study could have prepared Cole for. The noise from the crowd disappeared entirely, replaced by the singular focus that separated successful riders from those who ended up eating dirt. For the first second and a half, everything went exactly as Cole had visualized. Volcano's initial surge forward was massive but predictable, and Cole moved with the bull's momentum, his body flowing with the animal's motion while his left hand maintained its death grip on the rigging rope. The countless hours of practice on mechanical bulls and Frank's patient coaching had built muscle memory that kicked in automatically. But at the 2-second mark, Volcano did something that Jake Morrison hadn't mentioned in his warning. Instead of the spinning jump that Cole had prepared for, the bull planted his front feet and launched his rear end straight up in the air, creating a motion that felt like being catapulted forward from the back of a pickup truck. Cole's carefully maintained balance shifted dramatically, and he found himself pitched forward over Volcano's massive head. Training kicked in, and he tried to adjust his position, leaning back against the bull's motion to regain his center of gravity. For a brief moment, it looked like he might recover. The crowd drew in a collective breath as Cole fought to stay aboard the spinning, bucking animal beneath him. Sarah Bennett gripped Frank's arm, so tightly her knuckles went white. From their position in the stands, they could see Cole struggling to maintain his position, his body jerking with each of Volcano's violent movements. Frank had ridden enough bulls to recognize when a ride was going wrong, and every instinct in his body screamed that his son was in trouble. "Come on, Cole," Frank whispered under his breath. "Stay centered, stay loose." But Volcano wasn't finished. At the 4-second mark, exactly when Jake Morrison had warned that the bull got creative, Volcano executed the move that had made him famous throughout Oklahoma. He spun hard to the right while simultaneously kicking his back legs up and to the left, creating a corkscrew motion that defied physics and sent Cole flying through the air like a rag doll. The trajectory was wrong from the moment Cole lost contact with the bull. Instead of being thrown clear to land in the soft arena dirt, his momentum carried him forward and down, directly toward the unforgiving packed earth near the chute area. Time seemed to slow as Cole realized what was happening, his body rotating in the air without any control over where or how he would land. The impact was audible even over the crowd noise, a sickening thud that immediately silenced 15,000 people. Cole hit the ground head first, his neck compressed at an impossible angle as his body weight drove his skull into the dirt with tremendous force. He rolled once and lay perfectly still, his arms and legs positioned in a way that made experienced rodeo fans sick to their stomachs. Frank was moving before Cole even hit the ground, vaulting over the arena barrier with an agility that belied his age and bad knee. Sarah followed, her face already pale with a terror that every rodeo family knew intimately. The arena's medical team was professional and fast, but Frank reached his son first, dropping to his knees in the dirt beside Cole's motionless form. "Don't move him," shouted Dr. Martinez, the arena's head physician, as he sprinted across the arena with his medical bag. "Nobody touch him until we can assess his condition." Cole's eyes were open, but there was a blankness in them that Frank had never seen before. His son's lips were moving slightly, but no sound was coming out, and most terrifyingly, Cole showed no response to the voices calling his name or the medical team setting up around him. "Cole, can you hear me?" Dr. Martinez asked, kneeling carefully beside the injured rider while maintaining strict protocols for potential spinal injuries. If you can hear me, try to blink twice. Nothing. Cole's eyes stared at the Oklahoma sky above the arena, but there was no recognition, no response to the increasingly urgent questions being asked by the medical team. Sarah reached the arena floor just as the paramedics arrived with a backboard and neck brace. She tried to get to Cole, but Frank gently caught her arm, knowing that the medical team needed space to work. Both parents watched in helpless terror as their son was carefully immobilized and prepared for transport. "We need to get him to St. Francis Hospital immediately," Dr. Martinez announced to his team. "Possible cervical spine injury with neurological involvement. Call ahead and tell them we're coming in with a priority trauma." The words hit Frank like physical blows. Cervical spine injury, neurological involvement. In the rodeo world, everyone knew what those terms meant, and the implications were too terrible to fully process. The arena had fallen into an eerie quiet broken only by the sound of medical equipment and the low murmur of 15,000 people who had come to see athletic competition and instead witnessed a young man's life change forever in less than 5 seconds. Many spectators were openly crying, and others simply sat in stunned silence, processing what they had just witnessed. As the paramedics lifted Cole onto the stretcher, his eyes briefly focused on Frank's face. For just a moment there was recognition there, and Cole's lips moved in what might have been an attempt to speak. Frank leaned closer, hoping to hear something, anything, that might indicate his son was going to be okay. "Dad," Cole whispered, so quietly that Frank had to strain to hear. I can't feel my legs." The words were barely audible, but they carried the weight of a nightmare that Frank had pushed to the back of his mind for 20 years of watching his son chase rodeo dreams. Sarah heard them too, and the sound that escaped her throat was somewhere between a sob and a scream. The ambulance ride to St. Francis Hospital passed in a blur of sirens, medical procedures, and desperate prayers. Frank and Sarah followed in their pickup truck, Frank's hands shaking so badly that Sarah had to take over driving despite her own emotional state. Neither of them spoke during the 15-minute drive. There were no words for what they had just witnessed. The emergency room at St. Francis was a controlled chaos of medical professionals who had clearly been alerted to expect them. Cole was wheeled directly into a trauma bay, and Frank and Sarah were directed to a family consultation room where they were told a doctor would speak with them as soon as possible. The waiting was agony. Frank paced the small room like a caged animal, his mind replaying the accident over and over, searching for signs he should have seen, warnings he should have heeded, ways he could have prevented this from happening. Sarah sat in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs, clutching Cole's rodeo program and crying quietly. "This is my fault," Frank said suddenly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for over an hour. "I should have stopped him. Should have made him choose an easier bull, should have insisted he wait until he had more experience." Sarah looked up at her husband with red-rimmed eyes. "Frank Bennett, don't you dare blame yourself for this. Cole made his own choice. We both know there was no talking him out of it. But I encouraged him. I told him stories about my own riding, shared all the glory without emphasizing enough of the risk. He looked up to me, and I let him think that taking these kinds of chances was worth it." Before Sarah could respond, Dr. Jennifer Walsh entered the consultation room. She was a neurosurgeon in her 40s with the kind of calm competence that came from years of delivering difficult news to families in crisis. "Mr. and Mrs. Bennett," she said, settling into the chair across from them. "I'm Dr. Walsh, and I've been examining your son. I need to talk to you about his condition." Frank and Sarah moved closer together instinctively, preparing for news they didn't want to hear. "Cole has sustained a severe cervical spine injury at the C4-C5 level," Dr. Walsh began, her voice gentle but direct. "The impact compressed his spinal cord and caused significant damage to the neural pathways that control movement and sensation below the point of injury." Sarah gripped Frank's hand so tightly it was painful, but neither of them noticed. "What does that mean exactly?" Frank asked, though part of him already knew. "It means that Cole is paralyzed from the chest down. The injury is complete, which means there's been a total interruption of nerve signals below the level of damage. He has no movement or sensation in his legs, limited use of his arms, and will require assistance with many basic functions for the rest of his life." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Frank felt his knees give out, and he collapsed into the nearest chair, the weight of his son's shattered future pressing down on him like a physical force. "Is there any chance of recovery?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Surgery, therapy, anything?" Dr. Walsh's expression was compassionate but realistic. "Mrs. Bennet, I wish I could give you more hope. We'll do everything we can to stabilize the injury and prevent further damage, but with the extent of spinal cord involvement we're seeing, the likelihood of any significant recovery of function is extremely small." Frank looked up at the doctor with desperate eyes. "But he's only 22 years old. He has his whole life ahead of him. There has to be something." "There is something," Dr. Walsh said firmly. "There's adaptation, rehabilitation, and the possibility of a meaningful life that looks different from what you all had planned. Cole is young and strong, and with the right support system, many people with his level of injury go on to live fulfilling lives." As Dr. Walsh continued to explain the next steps, surgery to stabilize the fracture, months of rehabilitation, equipment and modifications that would be needed, Frank found himself thinking about the conversation he'd had with Cole just that morning. His son had asked if he regretted his rodeo career, and Frank had answered that he'd never regretted a second of the riding itself. Now, sitting in a hospital consultation room and learning that Cole would never walk again, Frank wondered if that answer had been the worst mistake of his life. The 8 seconds that Cole had dreamed about for years had lasted less than 5, and they had cost him everything he'd worked toward. Outside the consultation room, the evening news crews were already setting up in the hospital parking lot. Word of the accident had spread quickly through Oklahoma's tight-knit rodeo community, and Cole's story was becoming the kind of cautionary tale that would be told for years to come. But for Frank and Sarah Bennett, there were no cameras, no interviews, no larger narrative about the dangers of rodeo competition. There was only the devastating reality that their son's life had been irreversibly changed by 5 seconds on a bull named Volcano, and the terrifying uncertainty of what came next. 6 months after the accident that changed everything, Cole Bennett sat in his wheelchair on the covered porch of the family ranch, watching the Oklahoma sunrise paint the pastures in shades of gold and amber. The view was the same as it had been on that September morning when he'd prepared for the ride that would define the rest of his life, but everything else had fundamentally changed. The physical transformation was obvious. The wheelchair, the modified pickup truck in the driveway, the ramps that Frank had built to make the house accessible. But the deeper changes were less visible and more profound. Cole's eyes still held intelligence and determination, but they also carried a weight of experience that no 22-year-old should have to bear. "Coffee's ready," Sarah announced, emerging from the house carrying 2 steaming mugs. She'd adapted to Cole's new reality with the fierce efficiency that had sustained their family through countless challenges over the years. The kitchen had been reorganized to accommodate Cole's wheelchair, and Sarah had learned to manage his complex medical needs with the same attention to detail she'd once applied to running the ranch household. "Thanks, Mama," Cole said, accepting the mug gratefully. His hand coordination had improved significantly over the past months, but simple tasks like holding a coffee cup still required conscious effort and concentration. The early days after the accident had been a nightmare of surgeries, intensive care, and the gradual realization of just how completely their lives had changed. Cole had spent 3 weeks in the hospital, followed by 4 months at a specialized rehabilitation center in Oklahoma City. The physical therapy had been grueling and often frustrating, but it was the psychological adjustment that had proven most challenging. For the first 2 months, Cole had refused most visitors and shown little interest in anything beyond the basic requirements of his medical care. The young man who had once dreamed of 8-second rides and rodeo glory seemed to have disappeared entirely, replaced by someone who stared out windows and spoke only when directly addressed. Frank had struggled with his own guilt and sense of helplessness during those dark weeks. He'd tried everything he could think of to reach his son, bringing Cole's favorite foods, sharing updates about the ranch, even setting up a small television in the hospital room to watch rodeo competitions. Nothing seemed to penetrate the wall of depression and anger that Cole had built around himself. The turning point came during Cole's 3rd month of rehabilitation, when a visitor arrived who none of them had expected. Tyler Maddox, the professional rodeo champion who had spoken with Cole before his fateful ride, appeared at the rehab center on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying a worn leather portfolio and wearing the kind of determined expression that suggested he wasn't leaving until he'd accomplished his mission. "I heard you've been giving the therapists a hard time," Tyler said without preamble, settling into the chair beside Cole's bed. "Figured it was time someone talked some sense into you." Cole looked up from the physical therapy equipment he'd been half-heartedly using, surprised by Tyler's direct approach. Most visitors had treated him with a careful delicacy that he'd come to resent. "What are you doing here?" Cole asked. Telling you a story you need to hear, Tyler replied, opening his portfolio to reveal photographs and newspaper clippings spanning decades of rodeo history. You know much about a rider named Jake Paulson? Cole shook his head. Jake was the best bull rider Oklahoma ever produced. Won the national championship 3 years running in the 1990s, had sponsors lined up wanting to put his name on everything from boots to breakfast cereal. Then one day in Colorado, he drew a bull called Nightmare, and 8 seconds later, he was in a wheelchair just like you are now. Tyler pulled out a photograph of a young man in rodeo gear, clearly at the peak of his athletic career. Jake was 24 when it happened. Doctors told him the same things they probably told you, that his riding days were over, that he'd need to find a new dream. Cole studied the photograph, seeing something familiar in the young rider's confident expression. What happened to him? That's the interesting part, Tyler said, flipping to another photograph. This one showed an older man, clearly the same person but with gray hair and laugh lines around his eyes. He was surrounded by young riders in what appeared to be a training facility. Jake became the most successful bull riding coach in the country. Turns out, all those years of experience, all that knowledge about bull psychology and riding technique, all the wisdom he'd gained about what it takes to succeed in this sport, none of that was lost when he couldn't ride anymore. Tyler leaned forward in his chair. Jake trained 15 riders who went on to win national championships. He developed training techniques that are used by every major rodeo school in the country. He saved more careers than he ever could have achieved just by riding bulls himself. Cole was quiet for a long time, processing what Tyler was telling him. You're saying I should become a coach? I'm saying you should stop feeling sorry for yourself long enough to figure out what comes next, Tyler replied bluntly. You spent 5 seconds on Volcano, but you spent 3 years preparing for those 5 seconds. All that knowledge, all that understanding of what it takes to succeed in rodeo, that didn't disappear when you hit the ground. That conversation marked the beginning of Cole's real recovery. Not physical recovery. The doctors had been clear that his paralysis was permanent, but the psychological and emotional healing that would allow him to build a new life from the wreckage of his old dreams. Cole threw himself into his rehabilitation with renewed determination, working with occupational therapists to regain fine motor control and learning to navigate the world from a wheelchair. More importantly, he began reading everything he could find about bull riding technique, sports psychology, and training methodologies. Frank and Sarah watched their son's transformation with a mixture of relief and admiration. The determined young man they'd raised was still there, just focused on a different set of goals than anyone had imagined. You know what I've been thinking about? Cole said to Frank one morning as they sat on the porch watching the sunrise. It was the 6-month anniversary of the accident, and Cole had insisted on spending it at the ranch rather than dwelling on what had happened in Tulsa. What's that? Frank replied, grateful to hear his son initiating conversation with genuine enthusiasm for the first time in months. All those hours we spent watching videos of Volcano, studying his patterns and trying to understand what made him so difficult to ride. I learned more about bull psychology in those weeks than I had in 3 years of actual riding. Frank nodded, remembering the intense preparation that had preceded Cole's fateful ride. I think I want to start a training program, Cole continued. Not just teaching technique, but really helping young riders understand the mental side of bull riding. How to read bulls, how to prepare psychologically, how to make smart decisions about which risks are worth taking. The idea had been forming in Cole's mind for weeks, inspired by Tyler's story about Jake Paulson, but shaped by his own unique experiences and insights. He'd realized that his accident, devastating as it was, had given him a perspective on rodeo that few people possessed. That sounds like something that could really help people, Frank said carefully, not wanting to discourage his son's first real spark of enthusiasm since the accident. I've been thinking about it more and more, Cole said, his voice gaining strength. How many riders go into competitions without really understanding what they're facing? How many accidents happen because someone took on a bull they weren't ready for, or didn't recognize the warning signs that something was going wrong? Frank was quiet for a moment, thinking about his own rodeo career and the countless close calls he'd experienced over the years. You're right that there's not enough education about the mental side of riding. Most training focuses on technique and conditioning, but not enough on judgment and decision-making. Over the following weeks, Cole began developing his ideas into a concrete plan. He reached out to other riders, including Jake Morrison, who had become something of a mentor since Cole's accident. He studied coaching methodologies used in other sports and began outlining a curriculum that would combine traditional riding instruction with psychological preparation and risk assessment. The breakthrough came when Buck Stevens, Volcano's owner, contacted Cole with an unexpected proposition. Buck had been deeply affected by Cole's accident and had spent months thinking about ways to improve safety in rodeo competition. "I've got a proposal for you," Buck said when he arrived at the ranch on a crisp October morning. "I've been talking to the Oklahoma Rodeo Association about developing a safety certification program for new riders. They're interested, but they need someone with credibility to design and run it." Cole listened intently as Buck outlined the opportunity. The program would be mandatory for any rider under 21 competing in sanctioned events, covering everything from equipment safety to bull psychology to emergency response procedures. "Why me?" Cole asked. "I'm the guy who got hurt doing exactly what you're trying to prevent." "That's exactly why it should be you," Buck replied. "You understand the risks better than anyone, but you also understand the passion that drives people to take those risks. Young riders will listen to you because you've been where they are." The Oklahoma Youth Rodeo Safety Program launched 6 months later, with Cole as its director and lead instructor. The first class included 12 riders between the ages of 16 and 20, all eager to compete, but willing to invest time in understanding how to do it more safely. Cole had been nervous before that first class, unsure whether he could effectively teach from a wheelchair or whether young riders would take him seriously. Those concerns evaporated within the first hour as he found himself naturally falling into the role of mentor and educator. "The most important thing you need to understand about bull riding," Cole told his first class of students, "is that the bull isn't your enemy. He's your partner in an 8-second dance, and your job is to learn his steps well enough to stay with him." He used video analysis to help students understand bull behavior patterns, teaching them to recognize the subtle signs that indicated what a bull was likely to do next. He brought in sports psychologists to help riders develop mental preparation techniques and stress management skills. But most importantly, Cole shared his own story, not as a cautionary tale designed to scare young riders away from the sport, but as an honest examination of risk assessment and decision-making. "I don't regret riding Volcano," he told his students during one particularly intense discussion about taking calculated risks. "But I do regret not being better prepared for what he was capable of. My accident wasn't about bad luck or an act of God. It was about a young rider who thought his determination was enough to overcome any challenge." The program's success exceeded everyone's expectations. In its first 2 years, none of Cole's graduates suffered serious injuries, and several went on to successful careers in professional rodeo. More importantly, the program began to change the culture around bull riding safety, making it acceptable and even admirable for riders to seek education and preparation rather than relying solely on courage and natural ability. Cole's reputation as a teacher and safety expert grew throughout Oklahoma and beyond. He was invited to speak at rodeo events across the country, consulted on safety equipment design, and eventually hired by the Professional Rodeo Cowboys Association to develop training materials for their national safety program. 3 years after his accident, Cole received a phone call that brought his journey full circle. Dr. Walsh, the neurosurgeon who had delivered the devastating news about his paralysis, was on the line with an unexpected request. "Cole, I have a patient here at the hospital," she said. 18-year-old bull rider from Tulsa, injured in almost exactly the same way you were. His family is struggling with the diagnosis, and I think it might help if you talk to them." Cole drove to St. Francis Hospital that afternoon, navigating the same hallways where he'd begun his own journey of adaptation and healing. He found the young rider, Marcus Webb, lying in the same kind of hospital bed where Cole had spent so many dark weeks. "I heard you might want to talk to someone who's been where you are," Cole said, positioning his wheelchair beside Marcus's bed. Marcus turned his head slightly, studying Cole with the kind of desperate hope that families in crisis often directed toward anyone who might offer answers. "Did they tell you that you'd never walk again, too?" Marcus asked quietly. "They did," Cole replied honestly. "And they were right. But they also told me a lot of other things that turned out to be wrong." "Like what?" "Like that my life was over. Like that I'd never be able to contribute anything meaningful to rodeo again. Like that I'd spend the rest of my life wishing I'd never gotten on that bull." Cole spent the next 2 hours with Marcus and his family, sharing his story and offering the kind of realistic hope that could only come from someone who had traveled the same difficult path. He didn't promise that things would be easy or that Marcus would ever ride bulls again. But he did promise that life could still hold purpose, achievement, and even joy. "The hardest part isn't accepting that you can't do what you used to do," Cole told Marcus as their conversation wound down. "The hardest part is discovering what you can do instead." 6 months later, Marcus became the youngest instructor in Cole's safety program, bringing his own fresh perspective to the challenge of teaching young riders how to pursue their dreams while protecting their futures. As Cole drove home from the hospital that evening, he thought about the conversation he'd had with his father on the morning of his accident. Frank had asked if he'd ever regretted his rodeo career, and Cole had been certain that the answer was no. Today, sitting in his modified pickup truck and reflecting on everything that had happened since that September afternoon in Tulsa, Cole realized that his answer hadn't changed. He didn't regret riding Volcano, even knowing how it would end. The 5 seconds that had cost him the use of his legs had also given him a purpose and a perspective that he never could have found any other way. The Cole Bennett who had dreamed of 8-second rides and championship buckles was gone, replaced by someone who measured success in the safety records of his students and the grateful letters from families whose children came home uninjured from rodeo competitions. As he pulled into the ranch driveway, Cole could see Frank and Sarah waiting on the porch, just as they had every evening for the past 3 years. The 3 of them had built a new kind of life together, one that looked nothing like what they'd planned, but everything like what they needed. "How'd it go at the hospital?" Sarah asked as Cole maneuvered his wheelchair up the ramp Frank had built. "Good," Cole replied, parking beside the porch swing where his parents were sitting. "Really good. I think Marcus is going to be okay." Frank smiled at his son, seeing something in Cole's expression that had been missing for a long time. It wasn't the fierce determination of a young man chasing dangerous dreams. It was the quiet satisfaction of someone who had found his true calling. "You know what I've been thinking?" Frank said, echoing the conversation that had started Cole on his current path. "I think you ended up exactly where you were supposed to be." Cole looked out over the pastures where he'd spent his childhood dreaming of rodeo glory, then back at his parents who had supported him through every triumph and disaster of his young life. "Yeah," he said, settling back in his wheelchair and feeling more at peace than he had in years. "I think you might be right." The Oklahoma sunset painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, and for the first time since his accident, Cole Bennett watched it without wishing he was somewhere else or someone else. The 8 seconds he'd dreamed about had lasted less than 5, but they had led him to something better than championships or buckles or any prize that rodeo could have offered. They had led him home to himself, and to a purpose that would last far longer than any ride ever could.